Today I'll be making sourdough cinnamon bread. I typically will use whatever amount of excess starter I have, but today, because I've kept my starter in the fridge for a couple weeks, I only had maybe a cup and a half of starter. So I fed the starter in the morning, and by late afternoon at this point, it was ready to use. To that, I added about 2.5 teaspoons of salt. To make this bread a little on the sweeter side, I added half a cup of sugar. You can use honey if you'd like, and if you do that, just reduce the water amount just by a little bit to make sure the dough isn't too difficult to work with. I added in 3 tablespoons of oil and then 4 cups of flour and a cup of filtered water. Don't be too picky about exact measurements when you're doing this. If the dough ends up too dry, just add a little more water, and if the dough is too wet, add a little more flour. And you can gauge where you're at based on, does the dough look like it does in the video or not, and that might be a little bit helpful. I stirred it for a minute to combine the ingredients, and the dough was pretty sticky to work with at first. I was okay with keeping it on the stickier side because kneading it on a floured surface brings it together nicely. Sometimes you have to be patient with the mess for a minute, or use the KitchenAid with the dough hook. I decided to knead the dough by hand this time just to show that if you don't have a KitchenAid, you can still make these bread recipes. It's really not that big of a deal. It is a little bit more work, but it's going to be just as possible to make it by hand as with the KitchenAid. When the dough was ready, I covered it with plastic wrap and let it rise for 6 hours. By the time I got back home that night, it was 10 o'clock, and it was perfect timing to roll the cinnamon in the dough and then leave it for an overnight ferment. I divided the dough in half and then rolled 1/2 of the dough out into a rectangle, about 1.5 feet long and about 1 foot wide. But it doesn't have to be an exact measurement. Just try to make the short side about the width of your loaf pan. The cinnamon filling is about 1 cup of brown sugar, 3 tablespoons cinnamon, and 2 teaspoons of vanilla that you stir until all the sugar is moistened. I did a little bit of experimenting here because I had less than a cup of brown sugar. So 1 loaf was made with brown sugar and the other I added to with our cinnamon sugar jar that uses white sugar. But there was almost no difference between the 2 loaves. So if you do half white, half brown, I'm sure that'll be fine. If you want the bread to have less sugar, that's fine too. You could probably get away with 1/2 cup of sugar for the filling, but I just recommend trying to make sure that 90% of the surface of the dough is at least covered with a sprinkling of cinnamon, so you still have a nice swirl through the bread. Remember that the cinnamon filling amount that I listed in the recipe is for both loaves, so just use half on the one part and then save the rest for the second loaf. So you can grease 2 loaf pans, or even better, you can use parchment paper and lay 1 roll in each pan, seam side down. Since my dough was longer than it needed to be, I just squished it in the pan the way I wanted it and covered it for the night with plastic wrap and a towel. It rose so nicely overnight. I set the oven for convection bake 350 in the morning and baked them for 30 minutes. If you don't have convection bake, you might want to give the bread a little bit more time. The loaves came out so nice and brown. I let them cool in a pan for 5 or 10 minutes, then used a butter knife around the edges before flipping them out on a cooling rack. But of course, if you have parchment paper, you won't have to do that. The glaze is just 2 tablespoons of melted butter, about 1 cup of powdered sugar, and about 1 tablespoon of milk, maybe a little bit more. You want it to be pourable, but only barely pourable. It will melt a bit as you pour it on the bread, And you don't want it all to drip off the bread, so you want most of that icing to stay on top of the bread. So you want it to be spreadable, but just barely pourable. You want most of it to stay on top, so the thicker the better. If I were to do this over again, I would have kept the icing a little bit thicker than I did. The bread had cooled for about 20 minutes at this point, and I think that's a pretty good suggestion for you guys. I wanted to serve the bread warm, and that was a very good decision. I put butter on part of my bread, but then I couldn't really tell because it tasted so good on its own. I didn't even notice where the butter was or not. So for the leftovers, you can warm it up or toast it. Spreading butter on it is, of course, yummy for the leftovers. Fresh, I don't think it's needed. Of course, with it having so much sugar in it, if you're going to toast it, it will burn a bit quicker, so just keep an eye on it in the toaster. You can store the leftovers in a Ziploc bag at room temperature for a couple days, and then after that, put it in the fridge. If you don't need the second loaf right away, what you can do is you could probably freeze it. I'd recommend not icing the one you want to freeze. Just let it cool and then slice it, put it in a bag, get all the air out of it, and then you can freeze it. This batch of cinnamon bread was a bit of a last-minute idea, and I'm really pleased with how it turned out. Thank you for watching.